Okay, we're going to first briefly talk about the best answer to the job interview question. How do you handle stress? Okay, you ever get that pointy question? How do you handle stress? And I want to point out before we even begin that this is a different question to when they say, tell me about a time you handled stress. Okay, a lot of people, well, some people anyway, don't seem to get that. I always get, ask these questions and they say, well, yeah, what if they say, this? Yes, I know, that's a different question. That's a behavioral question. We're talking about if they say, how do you handle stress? That's where they're not necessarily looking for a story. They're just saying, you have to explain, right? So sometimes you see this pointed question. This question, you get it a little bit more in management type interviews. So if you're going to be a supervisor or mid-level manager, something like that, they'll probably ask you this type of question. Oh, man. Yep, here we go. So what do we do here? Listen, this question is yet another trap. A lot of questions they ask in job interviews are essentially traps. They're seeing if you're going to give them rope to hang you, or you're going to give, what's the expression? Enough rope to hang yourself. They're going to give you the rope to hang yourself. Right? That's exactly what these questions are. They're not questions where you talk about your positives. They're questions where you talk about your negatives because they're asking you about a negative thing, namely you being stressed. Now, the problem is if you really give them what they want and you get into the details, you're going to be talking all about how you've been stressed in the past, how you tend to get stressed, all the things you've had to do to cope with stress, which gives the impression that you're stressed a lot. And the more you talk in a question like this, it's bad, because the more you say these things, the more they get a first impression of a person who is stressed regularly, and it's a big deal, okay? And it isn't, or probably isn't, because the only reason you're talking about it is because they brought it up, right? So you want to get off this question quickly. And there's one pretty simple way to do this that usually works, is when they ask you, tell me about a time, or not tell me about a time, but how do you handle stress thing. I forgot the question there. How do you handle stress? You say, I actually handle it very well. And then you shut the hell up, because you're not going to keep running your mouth. And what you get is you get a very small gap in the conversation because you're not talking. They say, how do you handle stress? You say, actually, I handle stress very well. Just like that. And 90% of the time, the interviewer, usually it's a recruiter, will just simply move on to the next question. They'll just say, okay, and away you go. But that's the strategy you take for this question, because the more you talk, the more details you give, the more there's a really good chance you're going to be giving out some red flags. Okay? To understand really why that's the case, we have to get into how the job interview is where they get a first impression of you. They have no idea who you are. They have your resume, but they have no idea who you are as a person. You're a blank slate. And if you walk in the room and say, I'm an executive manager, or I'm a student, or whatever, that will frame who you are to them, because they're just getting a first impression of you, right? And it could go both ways. They could think that you're awesome, or they could think that you're completely unsuitable. And so that's why these questions are important to get right. Okay, so that's how, this is a very short one today. That's how you answer that question. And if you feel you must say something else, like they push you, they say like, well, could you give me some more details or something like that? You employ the same strategy where you give a very curt, safe answer where you say the right thing, and then you shut the hell up. So for example, they start off by saying, how do you handle stress? And you say, oh, I handle it very well. And then you get that silence. And then they go, okay, that's good. Can you give us a bit more details? And then you would say something like, well, stress occurs from time to time. It's a normal part of any job. but I've never had a problem with it in the past. And then you wait for the next question, right? I know it seems weird, but that's the best way to answer that question. When you're in a job interview, you don't have a lot of time to speak freely, and you want to spend that time talking about relevant things. An example of what not an irrelevant thing would be, what you don't want to end up talking about, is how you're bad at stuff. For example, how you get stressed. You don't want to go into detail here. What are your weaknesses? All the things that you might have an issue with. You don't want to go into detail with that stuff. All the things from your past that you did at other jobs that have nothing to do with this job, you don't want to talk about that stuff at length. What you do want to talk about is how awesome you are, how you have all kinds of skills, all kinds of education, all kinds of experience, and how you can bring them all to do an awesome job for these people in this role. That's what you want to talk about. So you don't want to spend time on questions like this, talking about how you've gotten stressed in the past and how you've had to mitigate it with all kinds of techniques, right? So that's the strategy behind questions like this. So just remember, they ask you about stress, you say, I handle it very well. If you feel you need to say anything else, you could say, well, stress is something that happens from time to everyone in every role, and I've never really had a problem with it in the past. And then you shut up and you get on to the next question where they ask you about your strengths or why you want to work here, and that's where you want to go into a lot of detail, giving them all kinds of reasons to hire you. That's how that works. There really isn't much more to it. Now, as I said at the beginning, if they ask you a behavioral question, okay, which is a completely different thing, where they say, tell me about a time that you were stressed or you had to handle stress, that's a different thing, okay? The way you answer that is the way you answer any other behavioral question, where you come with, I recommend 10 stories from your past that have been rehearsed and vetted, and they're all up here in your head. You've practiced saying them in the STAR format or some other very convenient, compact format. You vetted these stories, they're safe, they're good to tell them, and you pull out whichever story of yours that most closely fits the question that they happen to be asking you. So if they tell you, if you've memorized 4 stories of big accomplishments of yours, for example, then they ask you a question, tell me about a time you were stressed, you could maybe pull out one of those. You tell an accomplishment story because there was a little bit of stress involved. It wasn't easy, but you kicked ass and this was the result, right? So that's a whole other thing. How to answer behavioral questions is a whole other thing. So I just want to make that differentiation.